Morning guys, it's the 19th of May, just after 7 o'clock in the morning. It's probably about 7:30. Welcome to podcast number 11, which is a requested podcast, and it's titled Franz Bardon, and it's about my opinions about the famous magician Franz Bardon. For anyone who's interested, that piece of footage that I just showed there at the beginning of the video is the mouth of the Ahuriri estuary where it flows into Hawke's Bay. On a couple of previous podcasts, I think, I've shown footage of that estuary from the outfall end, from the other end about 4 kilometres back in towards the hills. And so this is the end which flows through the estuary and out into Hawke's Bay, and you can see the yacht marina. I often walk down here about 3 days a week in the morning, and so that's what you saw. And I'm now continuing the podcast a little bit later in the morning. It's about 10 o'clock now. It's supposed to rain this afternoon, so I'm trying to get this done while the light is still good and while it's still sunny. As I mentioned previously, the subject of this podcast is my opinions about the occultist known as Franz Bardon. This is a requested podcast subject, and thanks to Eric Summers for making that request. For anybody who's not aware of what this request situation is about, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, any of my subscribers, anyone who's watching these videos who is interested in requesting me to talk on a specific subject can contact me directly via my email, which is in the description section below. There's a link to my email address. So this is the first of the requested podcasts, and I'm doing this in the middle of the series on the 6 primary Partsufim. And I thought I'd just throw this in, since Eric had asked me to do this, and I thought I'd just throw this in here just to give us a break from discussing the subject of the Partsufim. So, Franz Bardon. The point in this podcast is not to explain Franz Bardon's system of magic or the culture that's grown up around him, but for me to explain my opinion about Franz Bardon and his system of magic. I'm doing this unscripted this morning, so this is really just a rant video, and I'm doing it this way because a good deal of the subject matter which I'll discuss here I have discussed in other places, such as the essays and the texts that I have compiled from those essays describing my views on Hermetism in general. So a bunch of that's going to be repeated here in relation to Bardon, because in explaining my opinion about Franz Bardon, I'm really going to take this opportunity to explain my opinion about Western Hermetism generally, and particularly the mainstream of Western Hermetism compared to what I've called the underground stream. Okay, so for those who are not familiar with Franz Bardon and who he is, he was a Czech occultist from the Czech Republic. He was born in 1909 and he died in 1958. So he's kind of slightly famous for being involved in the Second World War, and towards the end of the Second World War he spent a number of months in a concentration camp, in a German concentration camp, and escaped towards the end of the war there. I assume that he was imprisoned by the Nazis because of his esoteric beliefs and practices. Bardon, I think, spent a lot of his time in Germany, and he became very famous in German occult circles in the 1950s, when 3 or 4 books which he wrote were first published in the 1950s. And then his popularity grew even further towards the end of the 50s, when those German editions were then republished in English translations. So he's very famous through these books. And the 3 primary texts that he wrote and published, which have made him famous, are called Initiation into Hermetic. So that was his first book, and it was an introduction to the study and practice of magic and his views on Hermetic magic. The second book was called The Practice of Magical Evocation, and it largely had to do with his beliefs about techniques for intoning magical words and formulas. And the third book, which he was famous for, was called The Key to the True Kabbalah. Now, there is a 4th book, but I understand, if I remember rightfully, that it was published a lot later, and it was a sort of a novel, but it was based on his life, and so it was kind of an autobiography, and it was titled Rubaphilos the Magician. And basically it was an autobiography. It was a story of his life as an occultist. So I first became aware of Franz Bardon and his books through my teacher. My teacher, when I first met her, she owned an esoteric bookshop, and that's how I got to know her, because I was buying books from her. And when I became her pupil, she was a lab alchemist. When I became her pupil, of course, I got access to her private library. She had 2 libraries, one at the shop, which she allowed friends of hers who visited her at the shop to borrow from. And she had a private library at home, which was largely just alchemical texts. So it would be safe to say that she had the largest collection of alchemical literature in the country, and certainly the most exclusive collection, because being a student of Frater Albertus originally, she bought a lot of literature back from the States and from Europe, which had never been seen in New Zealand, and a lot of it still has never been seen here. So she used to allow, I used to go and work in her lab with her on weekends for about 9 years. Almost every weekend I was at her home working with her in her lab, and during those times while we were waiting for different processes to be completed, she would give me access to her library, and I would spend a lot of time lounging around in her backyard reading books, which is where I first got access to Bardon's material. So she was a big fan of Bardon. Like most people who are familiar with him, they become quite impressed with his work. And the big thing about Franz Bardon is he stood out as a very competent Western occultist. He presented himself as being an individual not connected with any other organization, although that really isn't the case, because he had teachers and he was privately a member of at least a couple of different very secret magical organizations in Europe and possibly in the Near or Middle East. But the image that he presented of himself in his books was that the system he was teaching was basically his instruction. He was presenting himself as being a solo practitioner in a manner, and that he was passing on his knowledge to serious students of Western occultism. I think one of the things that appeals to people about Bardon's writings is that they are very clear and concise, and the methods that he describes for magical self-development are complete, and they are a series of instructions which anybody can pretty much follow who's got even just a basic understanding of magical practice and technique. So he was a very approachable person, and his writing style was very easy to understand, easily digestible. So there is a large community worldwide of people who very much appreciate Franz Bardon and take his writings and his work very serious, and who have gained a lot from practicing his system. So he is a reputable individual, and he's highly respected by the people who know his system very well. So when considering my opinions about Bardon, or to be quite honest with you, about any occultist who is popularly and publicly known, my views are the same with them all pretty much. The first thing we need to understand is that there are basically two approaches to the study of magic. And we can also talk about that in a broader sense and say two approaches to the study of Hermetism. And the Greeks had specific technical terms for these words which have been used in English-speaking countries for centuries, and they are the thaumaturgic approach and the theurgic approach. Thaumaturgy is a Greek word which basically means a person who practices magic for the sake of mastering or displaying magical prowess. In other words, a thaumaturge, a person who is only interested in magic or Hermetism for the purpose of thaumaturgy, is somebody who is interested in magic for the sake of magic itself. In other words, they want to be able to master the ability to mess with the natural state of reality. They want to be able to affect relationships, attract and repel objects from themselves, talk to disembodied spirits in order to gain certain kinds of information for whatever their own purposes are. They want to be able to do all those things, be psychic and clairvoyant and so on and so forth. They want to be able to do all of those things for their own purposes, and often with the motive of affecting the natural condition of mundane life. They want to be able to change their life. They want to get new jobs, they want to get a new car, they want a new lover, they want to punish people for behaving badly, but they want to do it in a way that can't be traced back to them. They want to attract or repel objects or situations from themselves, and so on and so forth. This is the thaumaturgic approach to magic. Magic for the sake of magic. And the motives for practicing, for performing magical rites and methods is completely up to the individual practitioner. They make a decision about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable to be applying the practice of magic to. The second approach to magic and Hermetism is the theurgic approach. Theurgy is a Greek word which refers to the use of magic as a means of connecting with the divine. So a more modern and up-to-date way of describing that is that a theurgist is somebody who isn't so much interested in practicing magic for the sake of magic, so that he can mess with the natural state of his external environment, his life, other people's lives. He wants to practice magic for the purpose of communing with the divine. Now, it's important to understand these two different approaches because the bulk of people in the mainstream are interested in magic as a thaumaturgic discipline. They want skills to change things. They're not interested in making a connection with the divine. By far, those who are practicing magic primarily to make a connection with the divine, in other words, they are theurgists, they are by far the minority in the world of people studying and practicing magic. My personal interest in Hermetism, magic and alchemy is for theurgic reasons. And my personal philosophy insists for myself that magic was originally and specifically designed as a means for the initiate to make a reliable and effective connection with the divine for the purpose of gaining higher wisdom and improving the productivity of his or her life. I'm not interested in the practice of magic, alchemy or Hermetism simply in order to manipulate conditions in my environment and to manipulate other people and situations. In my worldview, thaumaturgy borders on black magic. No matter how good the individual's intentions are for using magical skill to mess with the natural conditions of external reality, no matter how good a person's intentions are, if he does not have a connection with the divine in order to understand what is productive in the use of magic or alchemy or Hermetism and what is not productive, if a person doesn't have that connection with the divine in order to understand what is productive and what isn't productive, what that means is no matter how good their intentions are, any magical act that they perform, any esoteric effect that they have on external environment could in fact be counterproductive to the divine plan. What is good and what is bad? What is productive and what is counterproductive is not a simple thing to understand. It's not straightforward and it's not black and white. And it certainly isn't a philosophic question to be answered by common human intellect. The natural world was designed and created by a superior intelligence, whom we most often refer to as the Supreme Being. And the natural world is of such a complicated nature, its structure and its function are complicated to such a degree that it takes a divine point of view to understand what truly is productive and what is not productive when it comes to acting in our world, especially when it comes to using magic. in order to affect circumstances in our world. So my personal philosophy is that first we must achieve success in theurgy, in making a connection with the divine. And today this is commonly called knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, or what I refer to as knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. The higher genius is the extreme summit of our individual existence, and that part of us has access to the divine plan, and communication with that part of us allows us to understand when we are acting, when we are trying to affect circumstances, what is productive and what is not. Now, all of this is important because it relates very specifically to Franz Bardon's system of magic and his situation. Now, for anybody who is familiar with Franz Bardon's books and therefore his system of magic, they'll know that his system of magic is thaumaturgic. In other words, he's teaching you methods whereby you can get access to magical skill, the ability to affect the conditions in your environment through the use of magical techniques only. That's all he's teaching you. When Franz Bardon talks about initiation into Hermetics, he is applying the term initiation to the concept of studying books and being involved in certain practices that allow you to apply magical pressure to the conditions of your environment. He is not teaching theurgy. In other words, he's not teaching a specific method for accessing one's higher genius in order that you can have a communication with the part of you that is connected with the divine, with divine consciousness, the part of you that can understand the divine plan. So somebody who is successful in the practice of Bardon's system and then gains magical skill, the ability to affect his environment, his or her environment, by magical means, that person could apply magical pressure to their environment in order to change things without knowing whether what they are doing is productive or not from a divine perspective. So in other words, such a person could be practicing what we technically would refer to as black magic. In other words, a magical act which runs contrary to the divine plan. Such a person could be practicing black magic without even considering that they are doing that, or being aware that it is possible for them to doing that, and being utterly convinced that they are a white magician and are only doing what is correct. And this situation can come about through practicing a system like Bardon's, because he does not discuss or describe the philosophy of Hermetism. In other words, the magical world view of Hermetism, what the rules are, what the structure of the universe is, the way things run and operate, what is productive and what isn't productive, the right order for approaching the study of Hermetism in order not to mess with the divine plan and the natural dynamic of things. Bardon does not enter into any kind of discussion on these subjects. This is a very common situation with occultists of Bardon's era. So now we're going to discuss the situation, the conditions under which Bardon's magical education took place, and then his impact on the occult community through the system that he provided to the world through his books. That's the next thing to consider, is the environment under which his system grew up and was disseminated. So the first thing we need to understand is the environment in which Franz Bardon was taught magic in Europe by his teachers was an era where the Western mystery tradition was basically being reinvented. During the late 1600s and early 1700s, the original Western Hermetic tradition, since it was imported into the West from the Near East, Near and Middle East during the Crusades, the Western mystery tradition had been established in Western Europe and had developed into a complete working system of its own particular flavour. And then towards the end of the 1600s up into about the middle of the 1700s in Europe, the Western mystery tradition all but died. The most significant parts of the Western mystery tradition went underground. And it is my opinion that this happened because there was a movement in the mid-1700s, up until the mid-1700s, to try and popularise Western occultism. And what this meant was a lot of people were getting their hands on occult knowledge from the old tradition, and they were being flippant about their study and their understanding, and the old system was becoming dumbed down, and so there were a lot of fools, unintentional fools, and also deliberate shysters that were becoming involved in Western occultism. And because of this, serious adepts who had access to true knowledge of Hermetism, of magic and alchemy, took what they understood and they went underground. What this meant was that this new popular surgence of interest in Western occultism was cut off from its source. And so a number of enterprising individuals who wanted to establish new schools of occultism in the West and have those schools possess a complete body of knowledge and an effective set of techniques for developing psychic and magical and alchemical abilities, those individuals now being cut off from the original teachings basically had to reinvent their own versions of what they believed the original tradition was founded on. Now, this was a difficult situation because while there were a lot of texts available to these people who were reinventing the Western tradition, people like Eliphas Levi, the French occultist, who was known as the father of modern occultism because he was one of the first people to start reinventing Western occultism. They had a lot of texts that they could refer to, but one of the problems was that while these texts provided a great deal of theory, to a certain degree, almost none of these texts provided an accurate description of practice. So if we compare the original Western tradition to, for example, the Eastern yogic tradition, we all know that yogic gurus have a number of exercises that they teach their students and a number of concepts and philosophic ideas, and that over a period of time of practicing these methods and techniques, the student will develop spiritually, they will become psychic, and possibly develop magical skill as well, able to access mystical states. Well, these individuals who were reinventing the Western tradition saw the Western tradition in the same kind of way. There must have been methods and techniques in the West which were being taught to students by adepts, but there's virtually no description of those methods and techniques, with one exception, and that was the practice of Solomonic magic or magical evocation through the grimoire tradition. The difference with grimoires compared to the other writings in the Western magical Hermetic tradition is that they are almost exclusively practical in their description and the information which they provide. There isn't a lot of discussion in grimoires about how or why the methods that they describe work. They just simply describe, take A thing, do B with it, and C will happen. So it's a very simple formula with no description of the mechanics of how these things work attached to the grimoire tradition. That part of the grimoire tradition remained hidden for a long, long time, up until relatively recently. So while the Western tradition was being reinvented by people like Eliphas Levi, and then later people like Pascal Beverly Randolph, who was an American black Rosicrucian who had a strong effect on Franz Bardon's teachings, and people like Mathers and his magical circle, all these people reinventing the Western tradition, they needed reliable, simple, practical, esoteric techniques that were kind of in the same category as the Middle Eastern techniques. So one of the things that was happening at the same time as this occult revival was that Westerners, for the first time in centuries, were voyaging into the more remote areas of India, into Nepal and Tibet. And as these adventurers were sneaking into those countries, because Tibetans didn't want Westerners in there at that time, one of the things that they were doing was taking occultists, or they were occultists who were going in teams, looking for yogis who were recluses that they could get access to in order to learn occult techniques, which then they could bring back to Europe and teach to Westerners. Now the problem with this situation is, in the East, their esoteric community is very similar to the West, where they have a true underground stream of real gurus who are teaching serious ancient esoteric methods, and they have a pop occult aspect to their esoteric tradition as well. The problem is, when Westerners went there, most often the people that they talked to and who they were taught by were not advanced adepts with specialized knowledge. They were the popular or mainstream level of occult teachers. Westerners therefore learned these pseudo-popular mainstream Eastern methods, which were incomplete, and the Westerners often misunderstood the nature of the training and so on that was involved in these Eastern techniques. They brought them back to the West, and then they integrated those techniques into the new Western occult systems that they were building up, structuring and disseminating largely through Freemasonry. Now the important thing about understanding this rebuilding of the Western tradition, this reinventing of the Western tradition that happened with its most feverish pitch from the middle to the end of the 1800s in Europe. Most important thing about understanding how this whole thing happened is that when we're looking at occult teachings today that claim to have an old pedigree and are part of the original Western tradition, the thing that we need to look for in order to discover whether the system that we're looking at is an authentic Western tradition from the pre-reinventing era is, does the system we're looking at contain ideas which obviously come from the East? And one of the things we know about Franz Bardon's system, which is very obvious about Franz Bardon's system, is that it contains a lot of ideas which came from the popular level of the Eastern esoteric tradition prior to when Bardon himself was born in 1909. In other words, we know that whoever Bardon's teachers were, wherever they got their information from, that collection of information, which is somewhat eclectic, is part of the reinvention stream of the Western mystery tradition. In other words, it's a very modern system and it's been put together in modern times. It is not part of the ancient tradition. He's not passing on medieval magical tradition. Pieces of the Bardon system obviously come from the pre-reinvention era of Kabbalah and magic, but mixed up in his system, all through it, thoroughly, are a lot of Eastern ideas, and some of those ideas come direct from Tibet, which tells us a lot about the period in which those ideas became part of the system that Bardon was taught and then passed on. While a lot of Western students of esoterica are happy to accept the introduction of Eastern concepts into the modern Western tradition, and then pass those concepts and those systems that are constructed from the introduction of Eastern ideas, pass those systems off as classic Western esotericism. While a lot of people are happy with that, I personally avoid that kind of situation for two reasons. Firstly, as I've already said, much of those Eastern concepts that were brought from India, Nepal and Tibet into Western Europe during the 1800s and up into the early 1900s, much of those Eastern concepts were pop occultism. They weren't part of the deep, serious Eastern tradition. To understand the nature of that situation and the danger of it, I strongly recommend reading a book by a guy called Gopi Krishna, and I'll put the title of that book just below here. He describes basically being a pop occultist in the East himself, practicing Kundalini yoga, and he describes the dangers of what happened to him when that process worked. He is a perfect example of the kind of Westerner that took that information back into Western Europe and either made a mess of it or manipulated that information and mucked around with it and changed it so much, watered it down, dumbed it down so much that it either became dangerous or it didn't work. A lot of those ideas are found in Bardon's work, and I personally have no time for that kind of stuff. My attitude is that if you have to take Eastern ideas and mingle them up with classic Western Hermetism, then what that tells me is that you don't have access to the full and complete working true Western system yourself, and you're trying to muck together a working system from bits and pieces that you find lying around in the popular esoteric tradition. I'm also simply personally primarily interested in the authentic classic Western tradition for what it was as a complete working system, which is another reason why I avoid systems like Bardon's. So that's the first angle on my attitude about systems like the one Bardon teaches that were put together in the 1800s and early 1900s by people who were trying to reinvent Western occultism. Most of those systems are incomplete, they're hodgepodge, they are thaumaturgic in nature. In other words, they don't care about communication with the divine. They operate from a standpoint that the common, mundane, everyday human is more than capable of making choices about the use of magic productively or unproductively by themselves without any connection with the divine. And I disagree strongly with that point of view. I also feel that systems like Bardon's that were put together from bits and pieces of Western and Eastern concepts are mostly popular and superficial level, and so they don't function as well as traditional classic Western Hermetism should. The whole philosophy side of Hermetism is almost always missing from these kinds of systems, and we can also see that in like the Golden Dawn school. There is no philosophic teaching there except for bits and pieces of it which were threaded through the ceremonial grade degrees, and which most modern students of the Golden Dawn system either ignore or do not absorb, and they simply do not understand the importance of the nature of those philosophic lessons. So here's the next step. After the problem with introducing Eastern concepts into bits and pieces of a broken down Western system, there's another aspect to that. And that is that originally classic Western Hermetism was composed of two primary streams, the magical stream and the alchemical stream. The magical stream concerned itself primarily with the esoteric understanding of the mind and how it could be exploited for the study and practice of magic and for the purpose of Hermetic initiation or connection with the divine, theurgy, connection with the divine. And the other stream was Alchemy, which was basically that branch of Western Hermetism which taught the true nature of physical matter and its relationship to esoteric philosophy and the esoteric journey. Now, when we look back over Western esoteric traditional history, if we could compile all of the books in the past written on the subject of Western Hermetism, or subjects that were part of Western Hermetism. We have a whole bunch of magical books, a whole bunch of books on Kabbalah, which are largely part of the magical tradition, and a whole bunch of books on laboratory alchemy and philosophical alchemy. By far, the greatest number of books is in the alchemical side of the tradition. There were literally thousands of books written on alchemy, particularly lab alchemy, but also philosophical alchemy, compared to hundreds of books written on the subject of Western magic and Hermetic Kabbalah. So by far, alchemy, particularly the laboratory tradition, was the largest part of the original classic Western mystery tradition. So another way that we can understand when we're looking at a modern system of magic, or a system of magic or Hermetism that's presented to us in modern times, another way we can understand the question of the authenticity of that system, whether it is part of the classic tradition, whether its teachings are accurate and safe, is how much does that system understand the true nature of alchemical teaching? How much of the largest portion of classic Western Hermetism does it contain in its teachings? In almost every single case, in systems that were invented and grew up in the reinvention era of modern Western occultism, in almost every case, there is either a complete lack of alchemical teaching, or there is a minute amount which is entirely superficial and teaches nothing of any significance about the laboratory tradition, or there is a corrupt view of the laboratory tradition. In almost every case in reinvention era occult systems, there is a lack of accurate understanding and teaching about Western alchemy. That situation has only just started being repaired in about the last 40 years. Yeah, about the last 40 years, since Frater Albertus basically left Amorc and went public with his alchemical teaching through the Paracelsus Research Society and the Paracelsus College. And of course now in modern times, through Jean Dubuis, because accurate alchemical teaching has been so efficiently provided by Jean Dubuis' philosophers of nature, really no modern Hermetic occultist has any excuse for having an inaccurate view of what alchemy really is anymore. And so a lot of very recent occult systems that have been created in the last 20 years have made an effort to include Frater Albertus and Jean Dubuis' teachings into their systems in order to present themselves again as attempting to present themselves as an authentic Western tradition school. Now the big thing about Franz Bardon's system is not only does it lack any accurate understanding of alchemy at all, Bardon actually discusses the subject of alchemy, and he makes a claim which is very common for systems that were invented in the era that Bardon learned magic. He makes the claim that methods which he's teaching in his book are alchemical, and they definitely are not. As I said, this is a very common practice for people who invented systems like Paul Foster Case's BOTA, he did the same thing. He made claims that things that he was teaching were alchemy when they were not. He also made claim that they were part of the original classic Western Hermetic alchemical tradition when they were not. Now, I understand that a lot of people don't want to hear that about Franz Bardon, and I've had this conversation with a number of Bardon people in the past where I've said, look, this guy claimed that these things here were alchemy, and they are not, and they just don't want to hear that. They want to twist things around and say, oh, but if you view it in this kind of... The fact of the matter is, when we study the authentic alchemical tradition, there is nothing in that tradition that is even anywhere like the ideas and practices which Bardon says are alchemy. There's nothing in the original tradition like that. So, in my opinion, and I insist on this, another indicator that the system of magic which you are studying is not part of authentic Western Hermetism is that it lacks an accurate understanding of alchemy. Even if the system is magical and isn't designed to be teaching alchemy, if it discusses that subject at all, and the information which it's providing is not an accurate part of the original tradition, then it's a reinvention. It's make-believe. It's part of the role-playing aspect of the popular modern tradition. Somebody stuck it in there simply to try and make their system look authentic. At the very least, any adept who creates a new modern system of Western Hermetic training and has not the intention of leaning on alchemy as an important part of that system, if that guy is if the guy who is inventing that system in modern times is the product of an authentic training himself, anything he says about alchemy is going to be undeniably accurate, even if it's only a small bit of information. That simply doesn't happen until very recently, in the last 20 years or so. So here's another important thing about Bardon's system, that he not only lacks any knowledge of what alchemy really was, but what he says is alchemy in his system is not part of the original tradition at all. And I say that with an understanding that I agree it's debatable that whether what he's doing could be construed in a vague, superficial manner as being alchemical. But I'm not interested in that. My interest is in studying authentic traditional alchemy, not modern kind of reinvention, New Age concepts about what alchemy is. In my opinion, those things are not necessary. There already exists a very powerful working alchemical system, which it is more productive if you study and practice that system properly rather than inventing new stuff before you've even understood the old stuff. That's my attitude. So this pretty much brings me almost to the end of this podcast and to the end of what I have to say about Bardon. I just want to add a couple of things to anybody who's made it to this stage of the podcast, and that is that I respect Bardon's system. I believe that there are aspects of his system which are probably very old and the aspects of the practical techniques that he teaches, which are probably very old and are probably part of the authentic classic era of Western Hermetism. I believe that the techniques which he teaches in his first book, Initiation into Hermetics, I believe that those techniques are a good introduction to what I consider a proper study of Hermetism, which is the theurgic path, which I believe everybody should begin with before they start messing with thaumaturgy. I don't think that Bardon's system provides enough information for anybody who is committed to the theurgic process, to connecting with the divine and to opening a communication with their higher functions. I believe the techniques which Bardon teaches in Initiation into Hermetics are a very good start toward walking the path of theurgic initiation, contact with the divine in oneself. But he doesn't provide enough information to explain what to do once that initiatory process starts kicking into action. And there is a very important aspect of this whole side of the initiatory question, which Bardon almost completely left out of his instruction, and that is the philosophy or theory of the guardian of the mysteries, the role of the Nakash, and its effect on the initiatory process, and the providing of an adequate instruction in what is required to manage what I call the shadow effect or the influence of the Nakash. Bardon's system is almost completely devoid of any discussion of that subject, which says an enormous amount about Bardon, because either he knew about the shadow or the Nakash and the influence that it has over the study of magic, and he kept that information to himself. And if that was the case, then he would know that he was promoting a situation where people would study his system and then possibly get themselves into a great deal of difficulty because they had no understanding of the role of the Nakash and how it can affect the individual. The other possibility is that Bardon knew nothing about the nature of the Nakash and the effect that it has on the study of Hermetism, and therefore that places him firmly in the realm of being an undeveloped practitioner of magic. And let me be polite in being a little bit more technical with the claim I'm making there, and I'll call him a lesser adept. In other words, somebody who's skilled, who obviously has some good knowledge and obviously brought that knowledge to a degree to effect, but that he was not at all advanced along the theurgic path of Hermetism. So I have a great deal of respect for the guy. I think everybody should read his books. I personally didn't get very much at all out of his Key to the True Kabbalah or his practice of magical evocation, which is actually his book, The Practice of Magical Evocation, is basically Solomonic magic, and it's taken straight from the grimoire tradition, and he published it in a cipher, but that cipher is quite easy to break if you understand what he's done there. He's basically reversed all the traditional names of the spirits that need to be evoked, and he's used the same Solomonic system. Most of the avid and serious students of Bardon who I've talked to over the years and who are interested in the subject of this podcast, which is my opinions about Bardon, my attitude towards his system, is that they really want to see Bardon as being an advanced Hermetic adept. And I can understand that because the tidiness of his system and how well he presents the information, and the effectiveness of some of the early techniques which he presents in initiation into Hermetics. Because of all that, people really want to believe that their pet guy who they've decided to follow is more important than he actually is. I insist that Bardon was a very skillful apprentice. He was not an advanced adept. It is more than obvious from reading all of his writings and being very familiar with his point of view and the breadth of the stretch of his understanding and knowledge, that he was unaware of the adept tradition as it actually is, the underground stream. He was unaware of it. None of those kinds of aspects of the Hermetic tradition are present in his writings. I'm always keen to emphasize the difference between mainstream popular Hermetism and the underground stream, the rare, true, accurate, extreme and impactful level of study. Bardon's system belongs to the mainstream, in my opinion. It is one of the tidier, safer, better approaches to Western Hermetism, in my opinion, if you're going to be trying to initiate yourself, or if you're only interested in thaumaturgy. But it is not a system that takes you into the theurgic aspect of Hermetism. It is not a journey into connection with the higher self. It doesn't teach the core philosophies of Hermetism, and it does not give you access to an understanding of the mechanics of the nature of reality. In other words, an in-depth knowledge of alchemy. It's missing from his system. Bardon's system is part of the mainstream. The underground stream is something quite different than the sort of thing that Bardon teaches. It's also very obvious, to sum up now, that Bardon's system is part of the reinvention of the Western tradition. And I state that for two reasons: because of all the pseudo-Eastern yogic terminology and ideas that are part of his system, and the lack of alchemical teaching. They are the two primary indicators that the system is not an old one. It's an eclectic reinvention. The problem with that is that eclectic reinventions can be unsafe, and they are often ineffective. At the very least, they don't provide the kinds of results which classic Hermetic magic was designed to provide. So with all respect to the guy, that's my opinion about Bardon himself and the system that he teaches, compared to what I know and understand and what my experience is of Western Hermetism. If you've been watching to this point, thanks for tuning in and paying attention. And podcast 12, which is the next podcast, will continue with my discussion of the Partsufim, and we will be starting a discussion on the higher functions, the three upper Partsufim, Neshama, Chia, and Yakida, and their relationship with the lower functions. And this discussion, the upcoming discussion on the higher functions, revolves largely around the real nature of Hermetic initiation and of the theurgic approach to Hermetism. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, if you have a specific subject which you would like me to produce a podcast on, you can contact me at my email address, which is in the description box below.
Feet were sore, till my knees were weak, and I couldn't travel anymore.